Glory, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. Great panel coming up to chew over the events of a breaking news heavy week, from fires in California to the aftermath of the Las Vegas massacre, Trump's many executive orders. But first, a quick word on the Constitution. I've been teaching con law at Fowler School of Law at Chapman University for 21 years. Before that, I served as a general counsel of 2 federal agencies, assistant counsel in the White House, and special assistant to 2 attorneys general, Lane French Smith and Ed Meese. I clerked on the D.C. Circuit. I know the First Amendment, and some things about the First Amendment are pretty simple. The United States Constitution abhors prior restraints, and, save for very narrow, very extreme cases, the Constitution will not permit the government to license broadcast outlets based on the views or their content, period. Now, President Trump is upset with media coverage, and that's no surprise. And some of that upset is completely justified. Much of Manhattan Beltway media is in outright opposition to the president. But all presidents have more or less degrees of outrage at the media, and President Trump's is just the most transparent. When it comes to that criticism, though, President Trump must realize, as have all before him, that while you can vent, you cannot vanquish or exile. You simply have to put up with it. Speech critical of the president, indeed of any elected official, no matter how right or wrong that speech is absolutely protected under the First Amendment, and we wouldn't have it any other way. Now to the week's news, and joining me to discuss the big stories past and future, Tim Alberta of Politico, Francesca Chambers of the Daily Mail, and Josh Kraushaar of National Journal, and Courtney Kube of NBC News, our own. Courtney, since you were part of what I think was the biggest story of the week, the president's grasp or non-grasp of the nuclear arsenal, tell us what you think was the biggest story of the week.
Well, I would have to say our story was the biggest story of the week in that it monopolized my week and part of last week when we first started reporting on it. And what I found particularly interesting, as you said in your intro, is just the response to it by the president, by the administration. What's
the bottom line of the story? Explain it for someone who's been in a cave for a week.
So there was a tank meeting, which is the Joint Chiefs Chairman's conference room, back in July, and it was a look at the whole. It was a worldwide briefing, U.S. force posture, and one of the slides, the briefing slides the president was shown, was the U.S. nuclear arsenal, and it was a historical look at it. So we're told by numerous officials who were in the room that when he was looking at it, he said, well, I want more. And then the conversation explained, defense officials in the room explained to him why there are budgetary constraints, there's treaty obligations that the U.S. is a party to, and then there's also nuclear nonproliferation, which has been a decades-old policy of the United States. So we did our story. I worked with several of our colleagues, Carol Lee, Kristen Welker, Savannah Guthrie, and Hallie Jackson on the story. And we just explained how the president, questioned this policy in a very provocative way. But people who we spoke with said that that's really his mannerism in a lot of these meetings. He asks these very probing and provocative questions to get his leaders, his cabinet members, to think outside the box.
Yeah, well, that was what I spent the most time on the radio talking about this week. That's why I put it #1. Tim Alberta, what do you think is the most important story of the week?
I would probably say that what we're seeing with the dismantling, the kind of unilateral executive dismantling of the Affordable Care Act is going to ultimately, I think, Hugh, force congressional leaders in both parties to come to the table and have to look at this thing in a more comprehensive way. What we've seen from coming from the ashes of congressional Republicans' failure, namely Senate Republicans' failure to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, is that the president has now decided, acting upon the advice of Rand Paul and others, to take matters into his own hands. And I think that's going to have some pretty profound policy implications, both in the short, medium, and long term, if, in fact, Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi realize that, with the proverbial gun to their head now, that they've got to do something.
So one national security, one domestic policy. Francesca Chambers, from the perspective of the Daily Mail, what do you think was the most important?
Well, I'm going to go with Iran, but I do hope we get a chance to come back to health care. I've got some strong thoughts on that as well, but I'm going to go with Iran being the biggest news story this week. The president saying that he's going to decertify that nuclear. Not because Iran is non-compliant, but because he just doesn't really like it, doesn't think that it's strong enough, and he's going to kick the issue to Congress. And their strategy for what they want Congress to do is a little interesting. They don't want Congress to put more sanctions on Iran. That's not what they want. They want Congress to amend this oversight legislation that gives Congress the authority to put more sanctions on Iran. They're basically saying, you guys only did that because of Barack Obama, so we want you to take that away, and we want you to put these trigger points in where if Iran crosses any of these lines, then sanctions will automatically be put on them. And so there was a briefing at the White House for reporters with Rex Tillerson, which is also very unusual for Rex Tillerson to come to a briefing at the White House for White House reporters. And he was repeatedly asked, what are those trigger points, right? What would they have to do for these sanctions to automatically snap back in that you're asking for? And he mentioned ballistic missiles. He also mentioned the automatic sunsets that are in the Iran nuclear deal, such as when we get to those points, if there was no new nuclear deal, no extension, that these sanctions would snap in. But he wouldn't detail any of the other ones even after he was asked. So that's something I'm going to be looking at as we move forward and see how this happens on Capitol Hill.
Josh Kraushaar, you can't say the Nationals like I can't say the Indians. So go ahead. Other than those two disasters, what was the story of the week?
I'm still in pain this weekend, but I'm going to turn to campaign politics. The civil war in the Republican Party. Steve Bannon declaring that he's going to try to find a primary challenger to almost every Republican senator, save Ted Cruz, in the upcoming midterm elections. He's already focused on Tennessee, where Bob Corker retired as a result of pressure from the right. You have the Alabama race, the general election now, where Roy Moore, who a lot of Republicans in Washington are really nervous about what happens if he gets elected. And you have a lot of races where you have very conservative Republican senators really running scared. A pro-Trump or even just a pro-Bannon, a hard-right primary challenger will at the very least force them to spend money, force them to divert their attention to the general election, and make the Republican Party into more of a Bannon-like vehicle than what we've seen in quite some time. And this has dramatic implications for the battle of control for the Senate. Republicans, because of the map, so favorable to them, it's unlikely they'll lose the Senate. But if you have to spend money defending some of the most rock-ribbed conservatives with these nuisance challenges and not spend money defending Dean Heller, Jeff Flake, and all the other battleground senators that have really tough challenges, it is going to be a nightmare for the Republican Party. And
second round of questions, underreported story. We'll start with you, Francesca, and move this way. Number one, underreported story.
Okay, I'll go with an aspect of healthcare. It's not that healthcare was underreported, it's an aspect so that we can discuss this. What President Trump did was direct the Department of Labor to do a study on what he's asking for here, and then the Department of Labor will make a decision about whether they want to allow these associations to buy plans or businesses. That is not how this got promoted. It was, I'm going to allow you to buy health insurance across state lines. It's not a mandate. The Department of Labor will do the standard common period, and then they'll decide what to do. Now, we know what Trump's Department of Labor is going to decide to do, but the biggest point here being that this is not going to be something that happens this year. This is going to be something that takes months. A senior official said it could take more than 6 months before you would even see these reforms that President Trump is talking about, and I think that's really, really key as this administration tries to claim this as a massive victory.
True.
And he said that this is going to help, millions of people. And I would like to see more information.
Tim, Alberta, is that also the most underreported? It's your most important story. Is it the most underreported story?
There's an argument that it is. I would actually say, though, believe it or not, that I think the president's comments on Puerto Rico, for me, it's significant if you think about it juxtaposed against we heard from this president as he was running for office, which was to say that he talked a lot about how America has been overextended overseas and that we need to come back home and take care of our own citizens. Well, you have a lot of American citizens in Puerto Rico who are in dire straits right now. Half the island without electricity, more than half the island without electricity, half the island without access to any sort of telephone, landline or mobile, so that if there was some sort of emergency in their family, they couldn't even contact law enforcement or a hospital. There are a lot of people there who are really hurting in a really bad way right now. So for the president to express exasperation or impatience and essentially say to these people in a very provocative way that, well, we might not be there to help you much more. After this is, to put this in perspective, 3 weeks after this hurricane hit, we've been in Afghanistan for 16 years. So again, juxtaposing this against what we heard from the president on the campaign trail, not only is it inconsistent, but it's just very jarring to hear
Courtney,
from an American
underreported story?
I'm in a totally different world than Myanmar. There are more than 500,000 refugees have fled Myanmar to Bangladesh. The UN this week called it ethnic cleansing.
This is underreported.
Nobody knows about
nobody
it.
knows
You know,
about
you talk to our friends, people who, well-educated people who read the news, don't know what's going on there. And meanwhile, more than half of the population of Rohingya have had to flee Myanmar because of a harsh and terrible crackdown by the security forces there. They're in Bangladesh. They're living under terrible conditions. They're starving.
It's the Nobel laureate curtain is down over it, unfortunately.
Absolutely. And the ones who are still back in Myanmar, there's about 500,000 of them who are still in Myanmar. They're